You are watching Co-op for Two, and this is your spoiler-free, before you buy it video for Bureau of Investigations, investigations in Arkham and elsewhere. Is this game for you? Let's find out. So what exactly is this game? The back of the box says that it's based on Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective series, but with new mechanics. But I think that vastly underestimates how different and interesting and experimental the new mechanics in this box actually are. Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective is a game that was made in 1980. It's a narrative reading game, and they're still putting out new cases for it up until 2022 when I'm recording this. In Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, you've got a box of different standalone cases. Each case poses a mystery and asks you to try to solve it. There are auxiliary documents with each game, typically a map like you see here, a little newspaper like you see here for case one. This one's single-sided. In Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, they tend to be denser, bigger, double-sided, etc. There's a directory of locations and names, again, thinner in this game than in most Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective boxes. And there are essentially two kinds of things you do when you play a Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective case. One is figuring out where to go on the map to read certain paragraphs and learn more information about the case. Sometimes that can be quite challenging. You might say, well, if a crime occurred here, let's go to the places next door. Or if there was murder involved, maybe we'll check drugstores in the phone book and visit them and try to learn more. And then the other key element is just putting together the dots of everything you've learned, figuring out when you've read enough to try to solve it. There's no time limit. You just play until you're confident of the solution or until you give up. And then you turn to the back of the casebook and you read some questions. There'll be a primary question or two about what really happened. And then there might be some auxiliary questions about sort of side stories. And then you'll get a score based on how well you answered those questions. That's standard Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective mystery game genre. But here, even though the box and the rules suggest that it's based on Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective and fairly standard, it's not really the case. Only the first two games bear a close resemblance to the Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective format and the print and play demo case. But even those first two cases have some substantially new mechanics. There's a very strict time limit. You're only allowed to read a certain number of leads, and then you must go to answer the questions or go to the end of the game. I said answer the questions, but that's not quite right, because another new mechanic is that you don't answer questions. You basically, when you're ready to solve it, when you run out of leads, you pick three locations, generally three, that are locations that you ran into during the course of your investigation. You pick three locations where you're going to intervene to stop the threat, whatever the threat may be in the current case. And then you look up those three locations at the end of the book to find out if you've succeeded in neutralizing the threat and what your score is. You might get a main score for going to the main important place, and then an auxiliary score for if you wrapped up a little side story. Then there's a third new mechanic, perhaps the most interesting one, which is unlike Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, where you have a map and you say, okay, I'm going to go to the hospital and see what's going on there, or go to this person's house and talk to them. Here, every single place has two entries in the case book, the clue book. The first one is interviews. You can see it's tabbed by the different sections. The first set of locations are where you go to interview, and then you can go to all those locations again and try to investigate. The rules are a little unclear about what the difference is, but essentially you can go to talk to the person who's there, or you can go to avoid talking to the person and sort of snoop around. And the combination of a strict time limit and then having to decide for every single place whether you want to go talk to the person or sneak around behind their back makes those decisions feel quite agonizing. If you wanted to do both, it would cost you 2 of your 15 leads, and so you quickly eat up the clock. Now, whether there's a good basis for deciding whether to go talk to the person or sneak around behind their back is a separate issue. I think the biggest complaints about this game are going to involve the fact that most of the time you won't have a good basis for deciding whether you should go to interview someone or go to investigate and sneak around behind their back. But the choice does feel palpably stressful and agonizing when combined with the time limit. So I've said that describes the first 2 cases in the box, and the rules talk about the whole box as if they all use those rules, but it's not true. The last 3 cases use completely different mechanics, and all bets are off. They don't look anything like a standard Sherlock Holmes consulting detective case. The game also describes itself as being inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft, but I think it would be more accurate to say that these cases are actually set in and heavily reference the mythology of H.P. Lovecraft. Many of the cases involve places that Lovecraft wrote about, creatures and characters that are directly taken from his stories. In one case, quite a bit of text actually taken from Lovecraft. They are true to the Lovecraft theme and atmosphere. There's madness, a sense of dread and bleak humanity and insignificance of man, religious cult, sort of adult, sad, scary things, and the incomprehensibility of the cosmos and a sort of science fiction horror feel. You might view that as a wonderful positive or a negative, depending on your taste, or just be neutral on it. But I do think it's fair to say that you don't have to be familiar with the Lovecraft lore to enjoy the games. Maybe it'll make the mysteries a little bit harder for you if you're not familiar. The box lists this game for 1 to 8 players. There's 5 cases here, 90 plus minutes per case. But I think you could probably expect somewhere between 2 to 4 hours per case. I think it's best at 1 to 4. You'd have a hard time playing it with more than that. A standard Sherlock Holmes consulting detective big box case tends to have 8 to 10 cases normally, but I do think the amount of content in this box is comparable. There's some debate about the replayability of this box, but I think these are essentially one-shot games. If you get it right at the end, you definitely wouldn't replay it. And there's a little bit of debate about whether if you fail a case, you could try it again. That's something you absolutely can't do with a standard Sherlock Holmes consulting detective box where you read the solution in the end. Here, you don't. You read the places you've guessed. But I think there's a reason why that doesn't quite work. But you might check out some house rules I've suggested on the Board Game Geek forum and the more in-depth video review of the game to follow this one for a discussion about how you might deal with getting a case wrong and maximizing your experience. So who is this game for? I think first and foremost, readers, and readers who enjoy the sort of adult horror, madness, sci-fi world of H.P. Lovecraft and that type of atmosphere. It is for armchair detectives, but probably those who are more willing to role play their choices in a world where solving the mystery is not the central thing. The central thing is the atmosphere and the experience of having a mystery adventure and exploring this different, creepy world. It's for groups who aren't overly concerned with having a carefully curated, balanced, and fair shot at solving a case. I think your experience is going to be a little more dependent on luck. And you have to be comfortable with the idea that a given group might have a totally different experience playing a game trying to solve a case than another group, depending on the sort of choices you make, which may not be based on a real deductive, sound reasoning. It's probably going to work well for groups that enjoy that feeling of dread and paranoia and sort of doom, and a feeling of not fully understanding everything that's going on around them, and maybe not even when you read the solution understanding everything that was going on. You have to sort of enjoy that ambiguity and mystery even at the end. I think if you really like the choose your own adventure type chaotic books that are sort of fun to see what horrible thing happens, then these probably will work well for you. And I think it's also going to be a great box of games for people who are interested in game design and the evolution of the Sherlock Holmes consulting detective style of game and mystery game in general mechanics. And those who take some enjoyment from experimental ideas and just variety. For those kinds of people, this is going to be a treasure chest of a box. Who might not be an ideal fit for this game? I think, first of all, maybe the Sherlock Holmes consulting detective purists. This is not a simple retheming of Sherlock Holmes consulting detective in a Lovecraft world. It is much more of a shift towards a looser adventure exploration experience. It might not be ideal for groups whose main interest is in challenging their intellect with a carefully staged and controlled fair mystery, which is much more carefully paced and arced. It might not be ideal for a group that has an aversion to time limits and does not like the idea of having to make arbitrary choices. You will have to do that quite a lot here. Choices about where to go next with a very tight limit to how many you can look at. Might not be ideal for people with an extremely low tolerance for rule ambiguities and minor translation issues. If you're that kind of person who throws their hands up when they encounter something that's not completely clear or seems like an editor should have caught it, maybe not for you. It's also not the perfect game in this genre if you're playing it more for the interpersonal, psychological, human pathos and interactions and rich, subtle, humorous dialogue, that kind of thing. There are other Sherlock Holmes games that do that better. It's also probably not a great game for you if you're highly sensitive to sort of adult themes and suffering. And maybe a special trigger warning that this wouldn't be the game for you if you're easily disturbed by the theme of child abuse, which seems to run throughout some of these cases. Some quick thoughts from my experiences playing the full set of games here. It does feel to me like this box represents a unique, opinionated, experimental tour of new ideas for the genre. I think people are going to be quite divided on this box, and different groups are going to have wildly different experiences with the different cases. I think the favorite case of one group is likely to be the least favorite case for another group, and vice versa, partly just based on their subjective preferences, but also based on what choices they made could lead to some wildly different outcomes. And how well they were on the wavelength of the author for any given case. That's the mark of an interesting game, and a game that's likely to spur some real discussions among your group if you're the kind of person that likes talking about games. If the idea of an interesting game appeals to you, that a game you can talk about afterwards, then this might be right in the sweet spot for you. It does feel to me like the box probably could have used another short round of editing and tweaking to tighten up the rules, but also add some stuff, a better endgame sort of explanation prelude before you do the endgame stuff, but also provide a much more fully expressed epilogue and explanation for each case. For a game genre that is so closely tied with narrative and story, it is so much like reading a book, it is disappointing that the ends of these cases provide so little in the way of a satisfying wrap-up. If you're on the fence, try the free print and play demo case. It will give you some feel for the nature of the game and the sort of chaotic nature of it. However, having said that, if you enjoy the demo case, I think you're really going to enjoy this box. But I do think that the print and play demo case, and to some degree the first case in the box, do not adequately prepare you for the ambition, the creativity, and the sheer variety of ideas in this box. So it will reward playing beyond the first couple of cases. So there you have it. Bureau of Investigation, Investigations in Arkham and Elsewhere. A mouthful. I cannot promise that you're going to have a great experience with each of the cases in this box. But what I can say is that this is a remarkable achievement. I highly recommend checking this out if you have an interest in the mystery game genre and want to see what's possible, what new ideas can be tried, and what it looks like to really explore the design space of these kinds of games. If you are interested in a more in-depth discussion of the new mechanics in the game, after you play it, you might check out my longer, detailed video that'll be mostly spoiler-free, discussing each of the cases and where they fit in and what's new, what works and what doesn't. And you might check out, after you've played the game, my playthroughs on YouTube of each of the 5 cases. They're about 8 hours each. And at the end of each of these playthroughs, we have a lengthy discussion filled with spoilers of what we thought of each case. And it might be interesting to see how your group differed from the way we played it. And with that, I'll see you next time.